You're watching the Gist on Stat News Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. With me in the studio today is Dr. Constantino Xavier, and we're going to be talking about growing Chinese influence, not just in India, but across South Asia. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Xavier. It's a delight to have you with us.
Thank you, Ram. Always good to be here.
Dr. Xavier, you're the co-author of a report which has been published by the Center for Social and Economic Progress. It's a 202-page report, so I've read it twice, so I know I've counted the numbers. It's titled "How China Engages South Asia in the Open and Behind the Scenes," and I know for a fact that it's gone a bit viral in foreign policy circles. But before I start asking you about specifics, I wanted to ask you, how did this whole project start? What was the motivation behind it, and how did you get such a huge scope?
Thanks, Ram. I think 3 points. One is there was a sense, as you know, of concern, and still is here in India, about China. There's a sense of concern that's shared not only by many of India's neighbors, the region, the West, about China, which tends to look at China with a very cautionary way, and almost sometimes even demonizing China, etc. At the same time, I had noticed in the travels across the region, in Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, for example, almost the opposite. A sense of welcoming towards China, a sense of joy that China would be offering solutions to these countries, that this was a reliable, all-weather friends partner. And I thought that, besides going down these two routes, let us find out what China really is doing in this region. We know a lot about China in Africa, China in Europe, China in Southeast Asia. We know still relatively less on China in India's neighborhood, what we call South Asia or the Indian subcontinent, etc. So that was one logic. The other one was doing this a bit differently. A lot of this work is done in the US and in Europe, Japan sometimes, but we have very little work from these countries. So we worked with authors from these countries to tell us, how do they look at China? They are living in these countries. They're the best mappers of this new actor called China in their countries in different sectors. So we asked them, tell us about the modus operandi of China in its many forms and ways, its themes, the tools, the partners that are shaping China in economic, military, digital, technology sectors, and what can we learn from it? And finally, the third and most important point, I think there's a lot of learning to do. I think there's a lot that the Chinese have invested in the neighborhood because they're playing a long game of influence. A question we got often is, why does this matter? Actually, China has announced something, say a conflict mediation project between Bangladesh and Myanmar on the Rohingya refugees. And if you look at our chapter from our first report, this is a second report, actually tells us that the Chinese haven't had so much impact in their conflict mediation. Then why are they doing this? They're doing this because they're playing the long game. They're building inroads with political actors in Bangladesh and Myanmar. If you ask many people in Bangladesh, they believe that China did a lot. So it builds an influence in the long term. And when the Chinese will have to do real mediation one day in Bangladesh, I'm sure that they will have a better understanding of how to do it with greater impact.
Absolutely. But how do you find the people? I mean, it couldn't have been easy to find people who are actually willing to tell you that, hey, China is, what you're saying is basically subverting us in so many ways. How difficult was it to find people who could actually say that to you?
Particularly because in many other countries, the scholars will say that, or the analysts will tell you that China is actually enhancing us and lifting us up and empowering us. So, I mean, the hard work is to find good scholars, Ram. That's what we do at CSEP as a think tank, which is good research, which is evidence-based. I can't say that China is destroying democracy in Nepal without evidence. I'm more interested to know what were the workshops that the Chinese Communist Party organized with Nepali political parties. What is the content of those discussions? What do they define as governance? How do they look at many sectors more than, say, toppling governments or playing electoral games in the background? How are they shaping the ideas that are shaping the politics of Nepal. So as researchers, if you have good people in the neighborhood, we have very good scholars across the neighborhood that are willing to do that work. Because all you're asking them is just show us the evidence. Map the elephant if you want, touch it, feel it, describe the beast, right? Because that is then, and then you write out these chapters, and then there's a lot of learning to do, because you find out that maybe the so-called beast wasn't that impactful as it said and projected it to be. And in some areas where the beast, with all respect to China, says, we don't do any of this, they're operating behind the scenes, things that are invisible to the open media, political scrutiny on a daily basis, but will have huge implications 10, 15, 20 years from now. Scholarships, outreach to think tanks, outreach to parliamentarians in these countries, the heritage sector, museums that are being built with certain narratives about China. These are all sectors that are shaping how these countries are thinking, and therefore are examples of Chinese influence in this region.
So it's gone way beyond, let's say, I think 20 years ago, I remember, J.N. Dixit once told me that, the way I guess it must be on the record now, that, they had got a report about how many of the communists the Chinese were actually paying off, in India. And he joked that, I gave it to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, and he asked me who else knows about it. And I said, it just came to me, it's a classified thing. So he said, you keep quiet about it. And then J.N. said, you watched, these guys stuck with Rao for the whole term, no matter what they said. So basically the document was used to. So, but it's gone way beyond that, is what I'm hearing from you.
I actually think, Ram, has gone below that. Let me explain. Supporting communist parties of different persuasions across the region, which China has done in the past.
They were far more powerful then than they are now.
Yeah, here in the region, maybe. But the point is, the Chinese Communist Party is far smarter now to play the game, which it used to when it was trying to, at least until the 70s, and then later on, less and less, to support communist movements and parties. This is the Chinese Communist Party today that is engaging royalists in Nepal, that is engaging dynastic conservative regimes in Sri Lanka, that is engaging Islamists in Bangladesh, that is engaging and mediating with the Taliban in a conservative movement in Afghanistan. So that is actually shows you the level of game of political influence they're playing beyond communism. It's almost beyond communism or below communism, if you want, larger ideas about governance, politics that are shaping these countries. Now, it remains a one-party state. It remains a party state. You're absolutely right. But what I find more interesting is that, beyond communism, they're engaging a variety of national parties, smaller political parties, subnational provinces in Nepal, for example, in Sri Lanka with the Tamil community, for example, in Myanmar with the non-Burmese ethnic identities, which they've always done with the Communist Party of China, the Communist Party of Burma, but today they're engaging with a large variety. So mapping that, understanding, the agility, if you want, a long-term agility is what comes out in the reports. And again, the credit goes not to me and to my co-editor, who's a real sinologist, Jabin Jacob from Shivnada University, but goes to the 20 or so authors, that have done this work. They are the ones who are telling us the story. So there again, it's not us telling the story. They are describing how they see China playing inroads. In many ways, telling us so listen, the Chinese are coming in very strong, sometimes invisibly, but this has implications for us in our countries, for India, and for other well-wishers of these countries.
You mentioned a lot of South Asian countries right now, but if you were to, let's say, because before we start going into India-specific kind of a thing, if you could name two countries where you think that what they're doing is something that India should be very careful about, let's say Sri Lanka and Nepal or wherever, or Afghanistan. If you could just give me two examples where most people wouldn't know that they're doing this, and something that we should be wary about.
So there's a great chapter, the two great chapters on Sri Lanka, in fact. One by Sanjana Hattutuva, which is on the digital footprint of the Chinese in social media, both on what used to be Twitter, which is now X, and Facebook. And how through very good, rigorous research methodology, you can see that the footprint traces you back to the Chinese state. So that means narratives in local languages that are spread on social media in Sri Lanka to pass on certain messages and therefore influence perceptions of China or perceptions of India or the United States of America or Japan and other so-called adversaries of China in these countries. So that's an excellent study. It tells you about the importance of the digital domain and the cyber domain, if you want, to how the Chinese state is investing in creating narratives and spreading them. Second one is on by Delaney, Professor Delaney from Colombo University, who's a legal scholar, and tells us a great story on how the Chinese companies and their investments in Sri Lanka have shaped the regulatory and governance frameworks in Sri Lanka, which means if you want to build a port in Sri Lanka, you can do a direct foreign investment, send your state-owned company, which the Chinese often do, but you also want to be sure that you don't get kicked out. So the way you do that is having an impact on the acts, the laws, the rules that regulate the port infrastructure sector in Sri Lanka.
Okay.
Because you are developing a system that is going to allow your investment to remain safe for the next 10, 20, 50 years and further investments to come. So you're creating a level, an unleveled playing field that is favorable to China because you're creating conditions that will allow future Chinese investments to be welcomed or will have it easier than Indian investments, for example, in the sector. So the legal angle is something you don't see often.
Right.
But the country's laws are being shaped by the Chinese state, by the Chinese government, by Chinese-funded think tanks, by Chinese-funded exchange programs and scholarships to parliamentarians, to political parties, to regulatory authorities. They are being shaped by Chinese support for technical assistance in different sectors to train people, to sort of training and assistance. So you see there's a variety of pieces to which China thinks big to achieve one end game. And that's a level of strategy which, of course, is
and
high.
Like you
and
said, they're
long-term.
also playing the long game.
Yes.
Well, let's talk about Bangladesh. I mean, because Bangladesh, again, is a country where we sort of think is our backyard in some ways, and they keep saying that, we only buy a few weapons from China and that's about it. How does that work?
I mean, great point you bring up, because see, one thing in the report we do is we're less interested in weapons transfers. I'm more interested in this, and I learned much more from two very great papers, again on Sri Lanka and on Bangladesh, on the invisible defense diplomacy that is shaping the doctrines, the ideas, the acquisition processes of the personnel that is in the Bangladeshi and the Sri Lankan armed forces. So the Chinese are, of course, selling weapons. We know that story. They've done so even with India's concurrence or acceptance, if you want, in Sri Lanka in the past during the end of the civil war. In Bangladesh, it's been tolerated, if you want, by India for a long time. But what is more interesting is that human, intangible impact through exchanges, new domains of warfare that they are training Bangladeshi officers, cyber warfare, space, peacekeeping operations, where the Bangladeshis are very important. So the defense diplomacy angle is much more interesting than the defense hardware side, which is equally important, but is more visible and we know about. But if you want, because it is the software that they're investing in. The hardware will come and go, you can sell. But if you control the software, which is the thinking, the doctrines, the mindsets, the laws, the acquisition
and
processes, the influence, and the leverage that comes from that, then the hardware will naturally flow. So it is that long-term game, if anything, I think that is of most interesting learning power from our study of how the Chinese are playing that. And many people say that is not important, it's soft power. Right?
No, I mean,
we are more worried about
I
the two
would,
submarines, or about a frigate, or about ammunition. No, we're saying exactly the contrary. It is a soft game of soft power, of influence that China is playing that will help them leverage and build influence over the next 20, 30 years.
I mean, I'll just come to you with a very small example that just suddenly struck me. The Chinese have given the Bangladeshis two Ming-class, ancient submarines.
Yes.
Now, we might say, those are obsolete things which are dead in the water. But when I was speaking to a Bangladeshi, he said, you watch out, we have two Chinese submarines. To them, it's a big deal.
And the people who are training them in how to operate those submarines from the PLA Navy. That is the greatest.
That is the other part of it.
Yes.
They're probably mapping the Bay of Bengal quietly, saying, it's a Bangladeshi submarine. But I'm talking about the average Bangladeshi. If you ask them, they'll say, you know what, the Chinese have given us 2 submarines. He's not bothered that they're, ancient stuff which might just barely. To him, it's a big deal.
See, that will happen naturally, Ram. I think that's natural that there's always a balancing game that these countries play, often to get more from India and from other players.
Of course.
There's little you can do. That's wired into the strategic DNA of any of these officials I've spoken to, whether civil or military across the neighborhood. They will play the best game they can. I think it is, but what really changes is that softer game of engaging and understanding, where the Chinese are building influence to actually very cheap, cost-effective ways.
And not only that, as you said, I think the words you used were long game, so that requires a different kind of planning altogether. But since we don't have much time, let's come back to India. One of the things I think, was it Jabin who wrote that piece on the telephone industry in India?
Krishnan.
Anand Krishnan, yeah, of course, yeah. I love that because, that's, forget the part that, yes, Chinese phones dominate the market here. I think there's a very nice analogy there about how they're sort of positioning themselves as almost Indian phones. Now, could you just explain that to me a little?
Yeah, so Dr. P.K. Anand, who contributed that chapter, I think tells us, that India is not immune to this influence. And we have another chapter by Devendra Kumar from Shivnada University on the influence operations of the Chinese Communist Party on the Tibetan diaspora in Nepal and in India. They tell us that this space is also not immune to the Chinese influence, right? In particular, in the phone manufacturing space, we have Chinese companies that have remained invested in this economy throughout and past Galvan. Have been maybe more cautious, he's showing us, but again are playing a long game also of being worried about protecting their investments and their stakes. And to protect your investments, any good businessman will tell you, you have to shape the environment of those investments. That is a labor environment, that is a often environmental standards environment, maybe less so in India, but also a governance and legal requirement, right, that regulates this economy. And there again, we see how the Chinese companies, maybe in a more cautious way here in India, but also playing with image, perceptions, advertisements, but also lobbies, etc., to play to protect their investments. So no country is immune. In fact, Europe has been, in many ways, naively exposed to Chinese influence. I think here we're much better prepared.
Every country you talk about Australia, they've influenced people there, politicians to business leaders, to everybody. But let's talk about the way. I was asking about the advertising that they do, which sort of makes them. In India we do have a sentiment of saying, we are anti-Chinese, China is our enemy, so we shouldn't buy things. But here we are buying more Chinese cars, more Chinese products than things, simply because of scale, of cost. Right. So the advertising that goes with it, if I remember from one of those reports, is that very, very Indian way of doing it, which is quite interesting. I thought.
Well, I think it's part of the image building, right? And surely China's image suffered post-Galvan. You remember the sort of ban on Chinese exports that was felt along the consumer base in India. Maybe there are costs to that, and we are beginning to feel the cost. And there's, a big discussion now whether India should and how it should engage, maybe not whether, but how it should engage and where it should engage with China. At CSEP, we're doing some of this work on climate and energy. We're questioning, where do you do this? On critical and rare earths, for example, if China processes 80 to 90% of the rare earths that are critical to any manufacturing base that is advanced, it's very difficult. You need to develop parallel processes, which now India is doing with parallel partners.
But you can't do that overnight.
No, correct. Long term. Again, long term, you have to play that game. You have to develop your base of processing here that requires financing, technology, good partners, whether it's Japan, the US, Europe, etc. And that requires a long
they need to process most of it through China.
Yeah. But about the cost effective, image is one thing, but image can be developed in many ways, Ram. And I think, for example, if you look at the chapter that Iram Ashraf wrote on Pakistan, on how the Chinese have systematically given out what they call BRI awards, the Belt and Road Initiative Awards. Everyone loves to get an award. There are a few people who decline awards. So it's a very cost-effective strategy where the Chinese embassy, through nominations, has given hundreds of awards across Pakistan. And if you look at the data set that she built, for example, it tells you also how the Chinese are thinking again. They're not giving these awards randomly. They're thinking through exactly who is going to be the best recipient. What's the best bang we're getting for the buck, which is very small, an award. Maybe scholarship, an award, a symbolic ceremony, etc. But the bang they're getting for the buck, which is the influence of those people, the cultivating them in sectors like as energy, media, academia, former government officials, is huge and builds that influence. So sometimes an ad may be nice and is important, but again, behind the scenes, you see a lot of this is going out from a strategic perspective. Every country gives out scholarships and awards. India does too. The question is, who are you giving them to? At what point? In what sector? With what objective? Right? And sometimes you do it for goodwill because you want to be seen as a source of soft power. But broadly, we all have interests, at least pardon me for being a realist. And I think states should constantly think and prepare where they're investing in. And that is one thing the Chinese state is doing systematically in India's neighborhood. Not only, but also with the objective to undermine and reduce India's own influence in these countries.
That is the other broader thing. I mean, we're almost running out of time, but I'd just like to, ask you a quick question right at the end. And I found that was a rather short, one of the shorter chapters, where your suggestions on how India should sort of handle this kind of stuff and what are the precautions India can take. Would you like to run us through that a little bit quickly?
I mean, one thing, Ram, we're talking about, which is an old issue, but we write in our papers overall, and we mention in our introduction, is to study China, we need good analysts, scholars, and a very strong Chinese research ecosystem. People that have lived in China, that speak the language. I don't. That's why I tied up with one of the, with Jabin, who's a China expert, and I have in my team also a China analyst, Shruti Jargat, for example. And that is what we need more of. So that's number one, a very strong Chinese research ecosystem in Indian universities, in Indian think tanks, that know China. Without that, nothing works. Second, I think, is what is very important is to, be humble in the sense that China will do a lot, right? But what are the alternatives that these countries are getting? The United States of America, as we speak, Ram, you see, is scaling back all its type of aid influence, scholarships, engagements. This whole soft system that the US has run for its own profit and interest is being scaled back by President Trump, right? So for these countries in the region, the options are becoming limited. They have noticed that China isn't as generous as it seemed to be 10 years ago. The Belt and Road Initiative is being scaled back. They're seeing the conditionalities that are attached. They're seeing the legal impact that investments are having. They're seeing the political influence that comes with economic investments. They're seeing the influence on their military forces. So they're noticing that. At the same time, I think it's a rare moment where across the neighborhood, and here I differ with many of my colleagues and analysts who say that India is losing the neighborhood. The sense I get, broadly, including in Bangladesh, and I'll say this, is that these countries will not achieve their developmental paths. They're realizing that it will not grow, and that's what keeps everyone awake in these countries. If you're the prime minister of any of these countries, you need to support the growth trajectory in these countries. And that they realize that India is an integral solution to this, that you cannot grow without India. So for the first time, I see, over the last few years, we're hearing also a lot of India out voices.
Of course, yes.
Cyclical, tactical. But if you see, the pivot goes back to the India in.
Particularly in countries like Afghanistan as well.
Absolutely. You see that with the Taliban. You see that with President Muizzu in the Maldives. You see that with the President of Sri Lanka. You see that, I risk and dare say, with the future dispensation that is going to rule Dhaka from next year, they're making voices already that need to engage with China, with India, sorry. So I think there's an opening also where, there is also a certain demand and expectation from India to offer developmental solutions, security solutions, etc. So it puts the ball also in India's court to say, what can we offer that is an alternative to China? And therefore, I think there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, the Chinese have been doing this in one or two of the other sectors. There's some things we can learn from China. Investing in your embassies, in your technical expertise on these countries, in delivering faster financial aid, disaster response, technological and digital solutions, taking the digital public infrastructure of any of these neighboring countries.
That, unlike China, we don't have strings attached.
Well, maybe some strings, maybe less strings, maybe different strings.
Mhm.
That's up to the countries to decide. But I think, first of all, we have to increase that capacity, continue doing what it is you're doing, which is deliver more, better, faster, study what China is doing, and finding also what your niche is. Let the Chinese do some things, right? So learn some things from the Chinese, tolerate others, and counter third bloc. There will be
Right.
things that are detrimental to Indian interests that the Chinese are doing. There are things that the Chinese party state are doing that are detrimental to the political nature in these countries, open, transparent. They're all democracies, multi-party, where there's constant political volatility, something the Chinese do not understand and struggle with. But it's actually something that India's been very comfortable with and is comfortable with. And I think, therefore, there's these three buckets are a good response. What can you learn from China in delivery of systems?
Mhm.
What can you tolerate or is acceptable and is not necessarily negative? And what is hurting Indian interests? And also understanding what those countries want. They will tell you what they need. And I see more and more those countries coming in and saying, the Chinese are breathing down our necks on this, or we're becoming a little bit uncomfortable with this. They will not say it in public around these days, but I can tell you that there's a sense in these countries of learning also that China is not going to be the all-weather friend and solution for every problem that many hoped 10 years ago when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced.
I suppose that's a hopeful sign for India, if that's what it is.
It's a challenge, and I think challenges are great.
Absolutely.
That's what keeps countries moving,
Absolutely.
to reinvent. And when you're being challenged, when you have a competitor, and I see this happening in the system, I guess that's why our report is having so much interest across academia, government, industry even, that this will have implications for Indian security, political and economic interests.
Of course.
The way these countries are going to develop and shape politically over the next few years.
Mm-hmm. On that note, I'm sorry, but we have run out of time, so we'll close for this. Once again, let me commend you for that particular report, because I was blown away. So I learned a lot from the way that operates, and I look forward to having you with us again.
Thanks, Ram.
Thank you so much. That was Dr. Constantino Xavier talking to us about a really, how would I put it, a very powerful report on how China has been influencing South Asia. Anybody who really is interested in China should definitely take a look at that report. The link for that will be in the story below. I hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to having you with us again. This is Ramananda Sengupta.